stuff. Look at
that. All right, it is 2:15. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I haven't seen anybody wander in a minute, so thank everybody for coming. This is Understanding Drupal's Cache API, lightning speed with low effort. My name is James Nedick. I'm a front-end developer, and I can be found on the general internets, usually at jnedick. And I work for At Design Group. We're a full-service digital agency. We are centered in Denver, Colorado, but we have a lot of remote workers all over the world, here in Pennsylvania, New York, France, Guatemala, South Korea. So we're distributed-ish. We generally work with some of the world's leading organizations in nonprofit and higher education. So we work with everybody from Stanford to Johns Hopkins, Human Rights Watch to the Guttmacher Institute. One of the things we like to say is that we do work that matters, and we're always looking for more of that work. So if anybody here is looking for a partner to help with a Drupal 8 project or a Drupal 7 project, we'd definitely like to talk to you and get in touch. I did bring a bunch of materials with us, sketchbooks if you want to take any of those with you. If you don't, I have to take them back with me, so I'd much rather they go with you. And the last thing that I will mention is that we are hiring. So if anybody is looking to work with any of the organizations that I mentioned before, also reach out to us about that. We're looking for developers of all shapes and sizes, designers, architects, project managers. So that is the end of the sales pitch, and we will go ahead and move on to caching. Any talk about caching wouldn't be complete without this quote or one of its variations. There are only two hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things. So why are we going to spend, an hour, 45 minutes or so talking about caching? And the really oversimplified answer is performance. A well-cached site is a fast site, and a fast site is better for your users. The more complicated answer is that Drupal 8 is a lot more complex than Drupal 7 was, and as a result needs a lot more of a robust caching system. When Drupal 8 first came out, there was a lot of talk about how non-performant it was, especially in comparison to Drupal 7. Jeff Geerling wrote a really good post. It's linked at the end of, it's linked in the final slide on this deck, doing a bunch of benchmarking of Drupal 7 versus Drupal 8, but also kind of explaining why those benchmarks are a little bit misleading and why a lot of the articles around performance in Drupal make a big deal about something that's kind of already solved. But this is a good comparison that kind of does exemplify that Drupal 7 versus Drupal 8 for anonymous and for authenticated users. Drupal 7 was just able to do requests a lot faster than we can in Drupal 8 without any caching. And the reason for that, to use this kind of blurry image, which you can sort of make out the idea, on the left is a full request graph of Drupal 7. And there's a lot going on. But on the right is Drupal 8, and you can definitely see a lot more branches, a lot more calls being made. So there's a lot more going on under the hood, and that just takes up more resources. So there we go. With Drupal 8's added complexity, we get a lot more possibility. We can do more things that we just weren't able to do as easily in Drupal 7. But the result of that is that we need a caching system that is as complex and sometimes as granular as Drupal 8 allows us to be with the features we're building. So the caching mindset. I'm going to disclaimer, a lot of those puns were written in the middle seat of a flight on United and also at 1 in the morning. They don't get better, so I'm just putting you in store for that. But what should we be thinking about when we're talking about caching? The general question that we want to answer is, when should the items that we're caching become stale? When are they invalidated, and when do we need to refresh them? Drupal content is very heavily built by referencing. So we're referencing multiple entities, and any one of those could mean another item is now out of date. So when we're trying to manage all of those different references, when we're trying to manage all of those different contexts, those are the questions we need to be answering whenever we're trying to think about anything related to caching in Drupal 8. Those thoughts are generally broken down into 3 categories: time, context, and dependencies. And as it would happen, those are directly built into how Drupal thinks about caching. We have cache max age, which is about time, cache contexts, context, and then cache tags, which manage dependencies. So we'll first talk about the easiest of the 3, time. The cache max age tag is super straightforward. It takes a positive integer as a value, and that value is basically the number of seconds we want this rendered item to be cached for. So you want something to expire after a day, figure out how many seconds are in a day, and you set that as the value. If you set that value to 0, it means this item should never be cached. And alternatively, there is sort of a constant in Drupal that basically says this item should always be cached, or at least until one of its dependencies has changed and then makes it stale. So that last one is the default setting for, I believe, most things in Drupal. And setting this when looking at a render array is just as simple as that one line. We wanted something to clear after once a day. We'd set it to, what is that, 86,400 seconds. A time you might want to do this, maybe you have like a weather widget on your site, and you want that weather widget to invalidate itself once an hour just to keep up with whatever's changing. So it's not one that I've personally messed with a lot, and again, it is one of the more straightforward ones. So we'll move on to one of the more complicated ones, and that's context. And I think this name is a little bit misleading because all of these ideas are a little bit contextual. So what we're talking about when we're talking about cache contexts is context on the request itself. So these are going to include things like the currently logged in user, that user's current time zone, perhaps the current language, and you could keep going, IP address, any sort of like request global idea. This is the context that we might want to cache this by. An example of this would be if you have, a news website and you want to make sure all of the dates are relative to whatever time zone the user is currently in, you need to make sure that that page gets cached for every time zone. So that's one item for contexts. Contexts are declared by basically just passing in an array of keyword strings into a context array. So this looks something like this. Now the question is where exactly are these time zone or language keywords coming from? How does Drupal know what to turn time zone into, for example? And time zone and language are both provided from Drupal core right out of the box. So it's not anything we have to worry about setting up ourselves, but we'll take a peek under like how time zone is set up. If you're familiar with Drupal services, every cache context is essentially just a service. So under the services key, we have the cache context prefix, and then anything after that dot becomes the name that we used here. When that's called, the service defines which class should be run to get what that value should be. And in the case of time zone, it looks like this. This class implements the cache context interface, and it only takes 3 methods that are reasonably straightforward. There's getLabel, which returns the label. Admittedly, I have no idea where that actually even renders anywhere, where it's used, but it is required. So, getContext is the value that we are the most interested in. This is what returns, here's the information Drupal is going to use to cache this bit of data. And then the last one is another one that I have admittedly not done a lot with, and it's a little weird for me to get my head around. You can get cacheable metadata, and we'll see this used a little bit later on in a more applicable example. Even though this is in and of itself a cache metadata, it apparently can also have its own metadata. all that class that it's calling does is just set it as an empty array, and it moves on. So it's not something I would worry too much about. Like I said, it's not anything I've really had to deal with, but it is one of the methods that you do have to define as part of the interface. So, and so that's setting sort of cache context in relation to the request. And then the last one are cache dependencies. These are essentially the equivalent of what it's called cache tags in Drupal. This is where Drupal starts getting information about all of the dependencies on content that Drupal knows about. So this is where you want to make sure that if you have a node that's render is cached, that anytime its user author is updated, or anytime a taxonomy tag that it's tagged with is updated, anytime a comment is added and updated, then that node needs to then know to reset its cache. So that's what all of these tags are doing. Out of the box, Drupal provides a bunch of cache tags for any entity that it knows about. And so we're taking a peek under the hood here, and it's worth mentioning, Drupal does almost all of this out of the box for you. This has existed, and up until recently, it's not anything I've ever really had to look into. It's just sort of worked. But understanding these concepts helps us know how to extend them when certain circumstances require. But it is worth noting that custom entities and configuration out of the box all have cache tags defined. The last thing that's a little weird about them is that they're not, or excuse me, tags are usually defined similar to contexts. It's just an array of strings that define whatever this identifier is. So it might be like node : 123, user 12, taxonomy term 13, or whatever those dependencies are. It's just an array that's set on that render item. So anytime those entities change, Drupal goes through its cache table to find anything that references it and just resets it. What is a little weird to me is that there is no defined structure for the string that a cache tag could take. There's sort of default conventions, like I mentioned, node : 123 is usually what you'll see a lot. But really, it could be any sort of string that the module maintainer or implementer wants to create for this. And as a result of that, if we want to manipulate or mess with any tags, we don't work with them directly, and instead we use a couple of methods that exist on any cacheable entity. And this is a little weird example, but what's happening here is on the build render array here, we're basically saying replace all of its tags, get the cache tags of the node object, and get the cache tags from the user object, and sort of merge them together. So we're not actually manipulating or creating these strings ourselves, and we're just kind of letting whoever's creating these entities or whoever's creating these cacheable items, whatever convention they want to use, this will adapt for us. Like I said, usually if you look under the hood and see like what's being rendered, there's a lot of conventions, but sometimes there's also some really weird one-off things. The last one we'll talk about are cache identifiers, and these aren't directly a piece of cache metadata. What a cache identifier is, and this is signified by the cache keys element in that cache array. This defines what the actual unique ID of this cacheable item is going to be in the database, and it's optional. So if we leave this off, Drupal decides we don't need to actually cache any of this markup. We're just going to pass all of its metadata upstream up to to its parent and to its parent. And we'll talk about bubbling here in a little bit. But if you do define this, then you could actually look into the cache table in the database and see the markup as it's rendered out. So the existence of keys means you're actually going to get a chunk of markup stored in the database for Drupal to use later on. Almost any entity is going to have this for any view mode. And again, as we're seeing kind of a common convention, this is defined by just an array of strings, and each item in that array just becomes concatenated to form that ID. And the reason for that concatenation is because as things bubble up, new items, as we're going to see here in a little bit, can add their own elements to that. and change those IDs as needed. We'll see a little bit more of these in an example here in a little bit. What this might look like on the back end, in our cache render attribute, we have the keys attribute, and we're just basically saying key it by entity ID, by bundle, by the ID itself, and by the view mode, and we'd essentially get a string that you'd see in the database of entity view node the node ID. So anytime Drupal is trying to look for, we need to look at 123's teaser, it just finds that string, grabs the markup from the database, and returns that rather than going through the entire render process for maybe pre-processed functions you have or alterations and things like that. And that's sort of the gist of a lot of this. Now, all of this, as I mentioned before, sort of bubbles up. Children pass their cache metadata up to their parents, and their parents up to their parents, all the way up until what's called the render cache or the response cache. And this is essentially the page level cache that Drupal is going to be intercepting. This admittedly is the one I know the least about. I have not had to work with it directly, only in one example. And we'll talk a little bit about cache bubbling. Like I mentioned before, all the metadata except for keys bubbles up all the way to the response level. The detailed information that then that response has about everything that it's rendering allows it to have some really granular means for clearing cache. This is why Drupal can have modules like the dynamic page cache and the internal page cache, which let us cache pages equally for both anonymous users, for authenticated users. We can have stubs of certain pages that are dynamic while everything else gets cached. It allows us to do some very involved things because of the granularity of information that the response now has. The nice thing about it is that it just works unless you screw something up. I'll give you 3 guesses as to somebody in the room who has screwed something up before. There's actually a really good blog post. It's also linked to in the sources at the end from the previous Next blog about just what I did wrong, and we'll take a look at their examples. I am, by default, a front-end developer. I spend a lot of time in Twig, sometimes in pre-process, and essentially what this is doing is something that seems really reasonable to me. I have done a lot. You find which fields you want to render into the template, and you just print them out. And to me, this seems like I'm being very clean. I'm not, misusing data. I'm not bloating this template unnecessarily. I just have the pieces that I want to render, and I'm rendering them. The problem with this that I learned is all of the cache metadata for this template exists on that content variable. But we're not rendering it. We're bypassing it entirely to drill down into the fields, to drill down into the links, to drill down into whatever we're drilling down into. We're not actually rendering content directly. Therefore, all of the metadata that we define does not bubble up. That means the response object no longer knows about any of that data, and you end up trying to really debug awkward things, and you spend a lot of time wondering why that is. So the solution to this is actually really simple. Just make sure you render out the content variable. So in this case, we're rendering content, but without the 2 fields that we're defining down below. Now this point example, there's a couple ways we could do this. It does have the downside that if there is anything else in content, another field that's on the view mode, maybe links, something else, that would get printed out in this context. So another example that you could do would be to just render content to just a twig variable that never actually gets printed. As far as Drupal's concerned, content gets rendered, that cache metadata bubbles up, and everything works as expected. If nothing else, this is the takeaway, I think, for me on this presentation, because this is something I would do a lot and then had to spend a sizable amount of time going back through all of my templates to fix this mistake. So always make sure you're rendering whatever your template's main content variable is. And if you don't have any more advanced needs for caching, then everything should still work as Drupal expects it to. Now, we'll go into kind of an interesting example for a project that I'm currently working on. And how do we start altering or manipulating the cache metadata to handle edge cases? To do that, we'll talk about a little bit of the limits of Drupal's cache system. We've talked a lot about the bubbling and the relationships and how Drupal does a really good job of maintaining that information from child to parent. All of that information sort of bubbles up. What it can't do is make sure that children are aware of things that happen to its parents, which now that I've said it out loud feels like it's something that could be applicable in a lot of contexts. So if we wanted to do something where a parent entity, say a paragraph, wanted to inject information down to another entity it's referencing, say override some information, override a title, things like that, Drupal has no way of knowing that when that parent entity changes, whenever you go in and click save on it, to then invalidate all of the children. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't have the context to do that. And that's the exact use case that I'm sort of dealing with. Right now I'm working on a publication website that needs a manually curated homepage. They want to be able to promote articles one by one in every context and then have the ability to override certain elements of all of those displays. So that means like their thumbnails as well as their titles could change. And the reason for this is a little weird. They ended up in a situation once where they promoted 2 articles to their homepage. One article was something related to guns or gun violence. The other one was a political piece about a politician. And they had 2 cards next to each other with a firearm as the thumbnail and the politician with the firearm pointing at it. Now, you would assume most reasonable people would understand, those are just 2 independent things. They got a lot of heat about the subliminal message they were trying to send. So they need control over how things are presented at a very granular level to make sure they're not unintentionally saying things they didn't mean to or being interpreted in the wrong ways. The promoted content, just to keep the homepage visually fresh, they want to be able to pick from a handful of different view modes to render it as. So you might have 2 or 3 different styles of teaser, 2 or 3 different styles of cards, and they have the control to, within reason, manipulate the design of the homepage to suit their needs as well. So this is a lot of control, but at the same time, at the end of the day, all of this is still view modes, in my opinion, as a themer. Rather than try to manage a ton of different templates, I can just pass everything down into the node template and reuse all of my same CSS, reuse all of my same markup. It seemed like a really good idea. And the last bit of this is that it usually falls down to 1 or 2 people who manage the homepage, and they don't want to have to go to a couple dozen different nodes and update, like, here's the homepage image field, here's the homepage title field. That would become tedious very fast. And so the solution that we landed on was, as I mentioned before, paragraphs. Paragraphs is great because you can create sort of a reusable component that is just essentially a page builder. You go through, you say, give me this article. Maybe I want to override the title. Maybe I want to override the image. Maybe I want to override the view mode. Maybe I don't. They have the control to do that. And as they just start adding more paragraphs to this page, they have full flexibility to do that. And paragraphs will then inject any of those customizations into the node via preprocess. So what you end up is sort of an interface in Drupal like this. The top one is the article. That's the only required piece. The next one is, if you wanted to override the image, you could upload it here, and it would replace the thumbnail that is on that reference article. And then in this case, we're overriding the title, and again, this value is going to be fed down into that article. Because these are entity references, it's really easy in preprocess to loop over the node, grab the title, and just pass it down to the render array of the node. And this all worked very well. We render out a card. We're getting the overridden values, except for the image, which is pulling from the node itself. So it gives them a lot of control and a lot of granularity. And for me, it's reusing the same visual styles that I'm using everywhere else, so it sticks to our pattern library. The code itself was very simple too. As I mentioned before, on preprocessed node, it's just looking to see if there is an override title item. If it exists, then we set the label for the node, and it was really easy. I was really happy with it. And then somebody showed me this. Because I can't, at the moment, do a live demo of the project, the context around this is this item, there it goes, this item exists sort of in a 3-column card type layout we've seen in a lot of places. This is that same item, and it's supposed to be in a teaser layout like the one at the bottom. But because those card items were rendered on the page before all of those teasers, Drupal didn't have the adequate cache information to be like, oh, this item here is different than the one we just cached up above. It just saw, oh, we're referencing that same article. Let's get the one we already have in cache. No big deal, right? Except everything's wrong. And so the way to fix that was we needed to make sure that we added the missing dependencies. And the dependency that we just added was on that parent paragraph. So we needed to make sure that all of those articles, or at least all of the, and not the article entities themselves, right? We're just talking about that render array. We're just talking about that render object as it exists in that one instance. It needs to be aware that it now has a dependency on the paragraph item that's actually placing it on the page. So we need to pass all of that paragraph's cache tag information down into the referenced entity. That way, whenever the paragraph is changed, then Drupal knows to look for all of those render objects in the database and just invalidate them all. So on refresh, it gets cached again. This might be a little bit hard to read. I apologize. This is the most dense code example, but we'll walk through this one a little bit. Because I'm lazy in typing, I set a lot of shortcut variables at the top. And then I just loop over all of the items in that paragraph field. So that in this case, it's called field reference content. For each of those items, I then get the node object. And item, in this sense, that's going to be the node render array. So you'll see like node, it'll be the title, it'll be which view mode that article should be rendered in. But item here, that's the article we're actually going to be rendering. We have a couple just helper variables here that check to see if the paragraph has any values inside the overridden image field and in the overridden title field. And then we just do a couple checks here. If the title is overridden, then we set item to that overridden title, which we saw earlier in the node preprocesses being, if this exists, change the title. We're doing the same thing for the image. All of that was the code that existed before to handle the overriding logic. The new part that needed to be added was down here at the bottom, where we are now merging all of the parent paragraph cache tags in with the node cache tags. And we're basically telling that node template, say, cache all of this together, so that way if this paragraph changes, invalidate this bit of markup. This markup you have stored is no longer relevant, just discard it. So that solved the problem of when our content editors went in and made a change to the homepage. Drupal at least now knows to change things. The last issue that we had was with conflicting cache IDs. And this goes back to the cache keys that we were talking about earlier. We were still, the render array for the referenced article still had whatever Drupal was setting by default. So it was still going to say, you know, node 123 teaser or node 123 card. That's sort of a global item that Drupal would just expect to use. So if we have our overridden homepage item, and that's the first thing that gets cached, anywhere else in the website that we're actually trying to display the same article is going to get the homepage version because it doesn't know that that's sort of an edge case and a unique thing not to grab. That's the tag that it's still using for, and it's being passed around. The homepage equivalent is being set to this item here. The other issue too is that because authors also have the ability to pick between which view mode they're using, we need to make sure that the cache keys aren't accidentally saying, the authors wanted this to be visualized as a card, but the cache IDs are still saying teaser. And so now anywhere we're calling it teaser, we're getting a card, which is why in that one list we saw the card view mode and then the teaser below it. There was just a lot of issues and conflicting namespace things. So we need to make sure that anytime we're changing things in the render array, we're also changing what their values are in that cache object. So this is the same snippet from before with a little items added to the beginning. To fix the issue with making sure that things are cached only to the home page and they don't bleed out into the rest of the site, we added just this little snippet here. And all we're doing is adding a cache key to the article that says, on top of this being node 123 in the teaser view mode, also make sure that we get a string that says paragraph and then the ID of that paragraph. Just so that way we have a unique identifier for this one instance of this item. And the markup specific to the home page is what gets stored in the database. The second piece is making sure that if we ever override the view mode, we just swap that out. So in this snippet here, we're basically looking through the cache keys on the article itself. We're going to get the view mode of it. We're looking for that delta. So you have an array of all of these strings, and I want to find the teaser string in that array. Once I have that delta, say it's the third item in that array, then I just replace it with whatever the overridden value is that the homepage author set. And then at the very bottom, we override the view mode. So instead of being teaser, it becomes whatever the value that the author provided themselves. And with all of those things in place, we get the same item. The top one is the one we saw in the card, but with all of its values overridden just for this item. So admittedly, that was a lot. These are the links to the couple posts that I mentioned before, but I definitely want to open it up to any questions or clarifying points.
Do you have a way to know what's getting cached and what the keys are? How do you kind of debug this? If you're running.
Yeah. This is where I start spending some time in the database. I use my SQL Pro just to inspect things. Anytime something is cached, there's a series of tables prefixed with the word cache. And the one we're interested in this case is cache_render. That's where you can see sort of what Drupal is rendering. And that's, in the case of the view mode, where I started looking through, why isn't this working? And I noticed that even though the key of it was saying, we're caching the teaser view of our article, when I looked at the markup that was getting stored in Drupal, it was all of the markup for the card. And so for me, then it was the question of why does the cache still think that, why does the cache for the teaser think it needs the card markup? And that's because I wasn't replacing the actual information in those keys. So it was just creating that tokenized ID and then being but still rendering the overridden values. So it was rendering the card, but Drupal was storing it as if it was a teaser. So you needed to update it in both, those keys in both places, which is sort of a new thing because I'm used to, I use preprocess a lot in Drupal 7, and it's just change the view mode to whatever you want it to be. But we never really had to kind of worry about how this might affect the cache. Did that answer the question?
Yeah. We have a similar type of thing with a user reference with some override, names or whatever. So I haven't run into this, but
and it was, we're doing a lot of they have a lot of specific needs on where they want to override or inject certain bits of information.
Right.
All of them worked until I enabled caching. So. Any other questions? right. Then I guess with that, we can go ahead and call this a bit early. All of the slides are available at this link. If you want to go check them out or reference them again later, it's available. And thank you all for attending my talk.